Okay, so in our last video, we talked about how supply and demand, so our price quantity and our curve, and we have our supply, let's run it right down there, and our demand, run it right from the y-intercept here, and how we have our equilibrium price and quantity, and we talked about the areas of surplus value. So we talked about how an equilibrium price and quantity is allocatively efficient because it maximizes the amount of value to the market through both the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. So the consumer surplus, always the area between the demand curve and the equilibrium price, and the producer surplus being the area between the supply curve and the equilibrium price in this case. So now we're gonna try setting a couple of things in motion that would perhaps interfere with that. So we've seen before that, if there are price changes by themselves, then those lead to a change in the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded. So I could say, let's say if this price went up to P1, I could say right here that, we've already identified that that this causes, a market surplus. It causes more to be produced than can be consumed in the economy. It inspires that, right? And we talked previously about how that would lead the market to move toward its equilibrium. We would have more supply than was demanded, so therefore we would start cutting the prices and we would start to move toward this equilibrium price. Now, what your book is asking is, what if this price was set as a price floor? In other words, what if we said by government decree that this is the price and it can't go any further than that? We set a law to indicate that. One example that we try to give is the minimum wage, right? I think that makes it a little confusing because, like in the case of wages, well, if we keep the price up, then you have more people supplying their labor than people demanding their labor. It kind of flips the market and puts this in the household, and this is business. I think that's a little confusing, but it still gives you the idea. And it doesn't matter what the product is. Once again, let's say that the government decides, okay, well, the producers of whatever it is, wheat, are not making enough money, and so in order to protect them, we need to legislate the price up. So I'm not drawing a dotted line anymore. I'm drawing a solid line. Well, okay, so we've seen what would happen here, where we've got a market surplus. But what is actually happening over here? Remember, we talked about the surplus value being the area of this whole triangle. But now, all that's being sold is this, right? So this is our quantity demanded, right? Our quantity supplied is, that's all the stuff sitting in the warehouse. Whatever, that's fine. But what's actually happening is that the market is allocating this much to consumers, right? So now what's happened here? We've got a price floor, and so our price is higher than the market equilibrium. Well, what did we call our consumer surplus? Our consumer surplus is the area between the demand curve and the going price. So this becomes here. We have a small triangle here, which is the which is the consumer surplus. Right? So you can see already that the consumer surplus, by raising the price up here, we have reduced the amount of surplus value, and that makes sense, right? If we raise the price, if we solidify the price higher than what the market will set it at, well, then there are less people who would pay more. You know, there are less people getting more value than what, you know, less people going to the store with a bag full of money and coming home with more than they bargained for, right? Same thing here. We've got but you see, we've got a producer surplus, which is going to run from here, and it's going to be this kind of strange shape over here. So we're going to have our producer surplus over here. We'll just kind of try and identify that by kind of cross-hatching it a little bit. And we've got our producer surplus here. So, in a sense, what's happened here is that this little area of consumer surplus has been transferred over here, you know. But what else has happened? You know, you've got this area representing your producer surplus, right, up to here. These producers who would have produced at this much, but they're actually receiving this price. But that only goes as far as the quantity that we're actually buying and selling, right? So what about this area here? This area used to be value in the market, but now it isn't. It's completely lost. Nobody gets this value. So that's what we call deadweight loss. Deadweight loss. And we're going to be abbreviating that as DWL, deadweight loss. So what happens is that when we set a price floor, it seems like a great idea because we're propping up the price. Right? Government is stepping in, interceding in the market to set a price above market equilibrium. But what happens is that the consumer surplus becomes a lot smaller. Some of that area is transferred over to producers. So producers kind of lose this little bit, but they gain this little bit. So there's surplus value that is transferred from the consumer to the but then there's this whole area of value that is completely lost. So that's why we say that setting a price floor is going to be, it reduces the allocative efficiency of the market. So let me erase all this and we'll show you what the opposite would be, because it is also possible, you know, and you might have asked yourself this question before. You might have asked yourself, okay, well, you know, if we have all this inflation and the government is worried about there being prices that are too high, why don't they just tell people to reduce the price? Why don't they just pass a law, right? Well, I mean, that seems like a simple solution, but it's not necessarily the best solution. And economists would tell you that this is the reason why. So we've got our supply and our demand curve right here. No, that's not, that marker has almost outlived its usefulness. Let's say, okay, so we've got our demand curve here, okay? And we've got our, you know, we always want to start out by marking our equilibrium price and quantity, right? Let's get into this good habit here. Price at equilibrium. Now, so what's going to happen if we kind of set a price ceiling? We call it a ceiling or a floor because you can't go any further, right? If you're standing in a room, I can't go any further than the ceiling. I can't go any further down than the floor. So if we call it a price ceiling, what we're saying is that the government is going to step in and say, no, the price has to be here. You know, I don't care what the market would say. Let's set it right here. Right? So we've got price ceiling here. Okay, so what's happened here is the government has stepped in and they've said, nope, the price cannot go any higher than this. You know, whatever it happens to be. You know, they like to give the example of rent controls. I don't really like that example exactly because in rent controls we tend to, we tend to set a percentage beyond which it can't increase. So it's kind of not the same as setting a fixed price. I kind of like just considering it to be any old object. It doesn't matter what it is, but the government steps in and says, okay, the price is too high. We're saying that you cannot raise your price beyond this point here. Okay, so what's going to happen in the market? Well, we have what's called a market shortage. Right? We've evaluated that in one of our last lessons, that we have a market shortage, so there's more demanded than supplied, but really the transactions that are going to take place are determined by this, right? So this is actually the quantity of transactions that are going to take place. Okay, so what has happened there? Well, we've got that price. This is all that's going to be supplied. It doesn't matter how much we want, you know, or are willing to pay for at that price. It doesn't matter. Suppliers are only giving us this much, right? There is a market shortage. And ordinarily in a market, what would happen is that all these people would be willing to pay more, and we would start to converge on this market equilibrium. But because this is a government mandated price ceiling, we can't allow the market to do that. So what happens over here? What happens to our economic surplus, that surplus of value that we used to have? Well, let's look at it here, right? So, you know, we've got this quantity supplied. This is the price. So what is the producer surplus but the area between the supply curve and the price? And that's our producer surplus right here. Producer surplus. Right? We're not getting any more. Right? So look at how much this is shrunk. This was the triangle here. It shrunk right down to there. So the producers have lost all of this surplus value, which is then transferred to consumers. What's the consumer surplus? Well, that's the area between the demand curve and this quantity at that price. So we've got this whole area, which is consumer surplus. Right? CS. I'm going to start putting these abbreviations because it makes it a little bit easier, right? But here's our consumer surplus here, this whole area. So there's an area here. This little square is an amount that's been transferred from producers to consumers, right? Because the price might have been up here. And consumers are receiving all of this value plus all of this value. So really what I would do is, if I had to calculate this, I'm looking at producer surplus being half the base times the height. Here I would divide this into, here's a little rectangle, find the area of this rectangle and this triangle, add them together. Your book does some of these calculations, right? I'm not putting numbers on it, so I'm not going to do the calculation. But then we have this whole area here, and I'm going to mark this in red, right? All this lost value in the market. So this is once again what we call deadweight loss. Deadweight loss, or DWL. Right? So here we are in here. All of this value that is lost to the market, you know. So the problem that we create by having a price ceiling, and you know, this should partially answer the question, why can't the government just step in and say prices can't go any higher than this? Why is that not our solution to inflation? Well, it's because we're reducing the allocative efficiency of the market. So therefore, the price is down here. The producers get all this less value. Consumers appear to get more value, but then there is all this value that is lost to the market. So it just absolutely goes nowhere. So that's why we call that dead weight loss. So you're going to be asked in a lot of your questions relating to this. We're going to say something like, okay, can you identify the area of dead weight loss? Can you identify the area of consumer surplus? And can you identify the area of producer surplus? Can you identify, for example, this little square that is transferred from the producer to the consumer? Right? Because in any of these things, there is always somebody who loses, somebody who wins a little bit. But then overall, in terms of and you could call this lost economic surplus, right? And that is a loss to everyone. And that's why we try to argue that a market should be left free to set prices, that prices should be based on a free interaction between buyers and sellers.